Welcome to NTD Evening News. Our top story tonight, O.J. Simpson dead at age 76. The NFL Hall of Famer and actor passed away after battling cancer. Dave Martin joins us to discuss his complicated legacy. President Biden teaming up with leaders of Japan and the Philippines to send a blunt message to China. That's as the Chinese Communist regime's aggressive actions risk escalation and a potential U.S. response in the South China Sea. Iris Tao at the White House. Taking matters into their own hands, a second state is now trying to implement its own immigration law, similar to Texas. Arian Pasdar has more on that effort and the challenges that come with it. House Republicans negotiating behind closed doors about renewing a powerful surveillance authority under FISA. What's next for the program that's dividing the GOP? Luis Martinez on Capitol Hill. And Harvard University returns to the standardized test requirement for admissions applicants, doing away with a temporary test optional policy.
This is NTD Evening News. Live from our NTD Global Headquarters in New York City, here is Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. Three nations in lockstep to counter Beijing. That's the message President Biden is trying to send as he meets with leaders of Japan and the Philippines at the White House. NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao has more on today's summit.
A new era of partnership. That's what President Biden touts as he holds the first ever trilateral meeting with the leaders of Japan and the Philippines. The three leaders vowing to deepen maritime and security ties with the goal
to build an Indo-Pacific that is free, open, prosperous, and secure for all.
The Biden administration says Thursday's meeting is focused on security in the South China Sea, a disputed waterway where Chinese Coast Guard ships have been ramming Philippine vessels and blasting them with water cannons. At the meeting, President Biden reaffirming the mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, which would require the U.S. to respond to an armed attack on the ally.
The United States defense commitments to Japan and to the Philippines are ironclad. Any attack on Philippine aircraft, vessels, or armed forces in the South China Sea would invoke our mutual defense treaty.
As Biden assures allies of U.S. backing in the face of Chinese aggression, the Japanese leader addressing a joint session of Congress on Thursday warned U.S. lawmakers about an unprecedented challenge from Beijing.
China's current external stance and military actions present unprecedented and the greatest strategic challenge, not only to the peace and security of Japan, but to the peace and stability of international community at large.
And as part of an upcoming announcement, the three countries will ramp up their military and Coast Guard cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
The Biden administration today finalized a controversial rule on guns. It requires that anyone who makes a living buying and selling guns must now conduct background checks. Today's announcement means anyone who earns a living predominantly by buying and selling guns must obtain a federal firearms license and conduct the checks. Gun rights advocates say the rule is a violation of the Second Amendment because it restricts the sale or exchange of guns between private individuals and heirloom guns that are passed on to family members. The head of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives says the new rule does not do that. ATF Director Stephen Dettelbach insists the final rule will not infringe on anyone's Second Amendment rights and that it will not negatively impact law-abiding licensed firearms dealers. The rule takes effect 30 days after it's published in the Federal Register. Defying the Biden administration and taking matters into its own hands, Iowa is the second state set to implement its own immigration law. NTD's Arian Pasdar has the details.
The governor of Iowa this week signed a sweeping immigration bill. Similar to Texas, Iowa wants to take immigration matters into its own hands. Now, if this really takes effect, it would be yet another historic law. It's because immigration has always been the job of the federal government, not individual states. The law would make it a state crime for someone to be in Iowa if they have outstanding deportation orders, have previously been removed from the U.S., or have previously been denied admission to Iowa. The law is scheduled to take effect on July 1st, but will most likely face legal challenges before that. Advocacy group Iowa Migrant Movement for Justice issued this statement on Wednesday, shortly after the bill was signed, saying immigrants' rights organizations are ready to fight back and work to block this unconstitutional law from going into effect. And in other immigration-related news, the White House is not giving out more information on President Biden's planned executive action to tackle the immigration crisis. He reportedly plans to restrict immigrants' ability to seek asylum. But as NTD reported on Wednesday, it's not clear if this will apply to all immigrants and to what extent the restriction would affect them.
Here's what I can say. We evaluate all options. Right? We do. We evaluate all options as it relates to executive actions. We just have not made a decision on this yet.
And lastly, some House Republicans are investigating New York City's controversial $53 million program, giving prepaid debit cards to illegal immigrants. They wrote a letter to Mayor Eric Adams saying handing out cash on transferable debit cards will only result in an increase of immigrants residing in New York City. The lawmakers now seek more information, including whether the program is using federal funds. Arian Pastar, NTD News.
Turning now to the war in Gaza as the fighting continues between Israel and Hamas, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed troops in southern Israel.
I said we are in challenging times. We are in the midst of the war in Gaza, which continues in full force. At the same time, we continue our unceasing efforts to return our hostages. But we are also preparing for scenarios of challenges in other arenas. And we established a simple principle. Whoever hurts us, we hurt him. We are preparing to meet the security needs of the State of Israel, both in defense and in attack. I and the people of Israel trust you. And may we all have great success.
This comes as Iran prepares to retaliate against Israel over the killings of Iranian generals in a strike on its consulate in Syria. Russia and Germany today urged countries in the Middle East to show restraint. Back in Gaza, Israel will soon build a new land crossing to the northern part of the territory. This would help deliver humanitarian aid from overseas or neighboring Jordan. And Israeli media reported that Israeli forces killed 3 sons of a Hamas leader without consulting senior commanders or Netanyahu. House Republican leaders are negotiating a compromise to renew controversial government spy powers that expire on April 19th. Our Washington correspondent Luis Martinez has the details on this 4th attempt to renew the surveillance program.
Speaker of the House Mike Johnson remains hopeful he can convince his House Republican colleagues to reach a consensus and reauthorize the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act.
There's some differences of opinion, but I think most everyone understands the necessity of getting this right and getting it done. And so we're going to try to find a path to do that.
House Republican leaders are trying to balance the need to maintain a surveillance tool that has helped thwart terrorist attacks and protect American civil liberties and privacy. House Democrats, on their end, have expressed skepticism to Speaker Johnson's strategy.
Speaker Johnson, who has signed up to essentially run a law firm that represents Donald Trump every day in Congress, that means standing with Trump when it comes to national security means standing with terrorists.
The idea that we would let this critical component of our security regime lapse would be the height of irresponsibility.
Speaker Mike Johnson reportedly plans to reduce the FISA reauthorization to 2 years instead of 5, thus promising House Republican an opportunity to amend the surveillance tool in case President Donald Trump wins the White House in 2024.
I want to be able to vote on the amendment that stops these warrantless searches. And I believe we have the votes in the House to be able to pass this.
FBI Director Christopher Wray warned lawmakers during a House Appropriations Subcommittee meeting of the perils of losing the powers of the FISA Act.
Let me be clear. Failure to reauthorize 702 or gutting it with some new kind of warrant requirement would be dangerous and put Americans' lives at risk.
House Republican leadership is planning on putting a new version of the FISA Reauthorization Act to a vote on the House floor as soon as this Friday. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
Joining me now to dive into the debate over FISA reauthorization is Jeff Carlson, an investigative journalist. Jeff Carlson, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Now, Section 702 of FISA is up in the air right now after what happened on the House floor yesterday. How did that vote play out? What happened yesterday?
Well, you know, it's a good question because there's a lot of confusion surrounding this. Yesterday was not a vote directly on FISA, nor was it a vote directly on having warrants required for surveillance of Americans. What it was a vote on having that issue come before Congress. And it all would have been kind of tied together, FISA as well as the amendments. And unfortunately, that was voted down. And the reason that I say that it's unfortunate is because, A, we're almost certainly going to see FISA come back before us, but we're probably going to see it come back before us without the ability to require a warrant for surveillance of Americans. Yesterday's vote would have allowed Congress, it would have forced Congress, actually, is a better way to say it, to vote up or down on whether they agreed that warrants should be required before surveilling Americans. And now that didn't happen, and it's highly likely that we're going to see this come back at us under a different rule set, and we're probably not going to have that warrant requirement attached to it. That's my guess.
Speaking of warrants, several Democrats and Republicans have been outspoken about Section 702 of FISA, saying it's been misused or even abused. What are some examples of that misuse?
Well, it's been chronically abused. There's a number of problems here. First of all, there was a report from the Inspector General, Horowitz, the same guy who did the Russia collusion report, the FISA reports. And what he found is that, first of all, there was an immense number of queries, something like 3.4 million queries of the database in 2021. And of that, approximately 1/3 of them were violating the rules that exist under the FISA database. So in other words, there was either roughly 1 million, I mean, think about, let that number sink in, 1 million queries that were either illegal and or improperly done. And there's another issue here as well, and it's one that goes way, way back, and that is the accessibility into this database. You know, in theory, people think that it's kind of limited and you have to go through all these rules and processes and procedures to be able to get to this information. That's just not the way it works. There's a minimum of 10,000 people that have access to this database. And, you know, when back in the day when Mike Rogers was working with the FISA court and they were trying to understand where all the entry points were into the database, they couldn't even find all of them. So it's a much more structural, fundamental problem here.
And what happened after this misuse was discovered? Was anyone held accountable? What happened to them?
Well, first of all, nobody was held accountable. You know, I mean, it's something we've seen time and time again. Nobody's held accountable. We're told that the problems are fixed. And indeed, we were told exactly that. There was a FISA report that came out in 2017 from the FISA court, and it disclosed a number of these problems, including the access points into the system. And we were told that this was addressed, but again, you have a Horowitz report, an examination of the FISA process in 2021, and the problems only got bigger, exponentially so. So, you know, we have a fundamental problem of improper queries going on at an enormous level, and we have a fundamental problem of far too many access points, too many people and access points that the system isn't even entirely aware of. So there's no way to say that we've either fixed the problems and or have proper oversight of the system. We don't.
On the flip side, Section 702 of FISA is often touted as an invaluable tool in stopping terrorism, especially after 9/11. Now, what reforms are needed to it, or is it just ending FISA?
You know, if you'd asked me this question a few years back, I would have said maybe more reforms, but I don't believe that. I've come to the point that I believe that there is no possible reform that can structurally fix this type of problem. You know, again, I would point you to the fact that even after reforms and a whole thorough investigation of the FISA system, Section 702, it's only gotten worse. The violations have increased, and they've increased at an exponential rate. And I just don't know how you fix it. And, you know, the idea that, think about it this way. The intelligence community dug in their heels and wholeheartedly refused to accept having warrants for any Americans that were being surveilled. Meanwhile, Congress put into the bill a carve-out that would require them to be notified if they were being surveilled. So what does that tell you? That tells you that Congress believes the system is broken. They want notification if they are being surveilled. They're worried about being surveilled and they want to find out about it. You don't have those same protections.
Jeff Carlson, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Over in Massachusetts, Harvard University is reinstituting the standardized test requirement for admission. The university announced today that the new policy would apply to the admission cycle for the class of 2029. The school began a temporary test optional policy in 2020 during the pandemic. Students could apply without taking standardized tests. The temporary measure was expected to continue through the fall of 2026, but the restored testing requirement will apply to students seeking admission in fall of 2025. Students will be required to submit standardized test scores from the SAT or ACT exams to complete their applications. Harvard joins other schools like Yale, Dartmouth, Brown, and MIT, which are also requiring tests for admission once again. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer, and now for your sports news, we're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, some big news today as O.J. Simpson has passed away. Now, he was 76, but was a cause of death given?
I mean, yeah, his family said he passed away from cancer yesterday. Now, he's obviously been out of the limelight for quite a while. Clearly, he leaves behind a very complicated legacy. I mean, first, he was an NFL star, wins the Heisman Trophy at USC in 1968. Then he goes to the NFL, plays there 11 years, wins an MVP award. He ends up in the Hall of Fame when he retires. But unlike some star players, he stayed in the limelight after retiring. I mean, he's great on TV. He does ads for numerous companies. Most memorably were his Hertz commercials. He was also in those hilarious Naked Gun movies, and he was also a TV reporter for some NFL games. But of course, they were all overshadowed by the famous murder trial where he was acquitted of killing his wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend, Ronald Goldman. I mean, it really was the trial of the century. They televised it every single day. You know, at first, no one could believe the charges against him. I mean, he was such a charming and funny guy. But by the end of the trial, pretty much no one could believe he got off. Now, even though with his not guilty verdict, I mean, TV networks wanted nothing to do with him afterwards, and he kind of went into the limelight after that. In any case, it's obviously a very sad day for his family.
Dave, well, shifting gears to baseball now, the gambling scandal involving the former interpreter for Shohei Ohtani has really taken off, with federal charges of bank fraud being involved. What is the latest on this?
Yeah, Tiff, it's a lot worse than we thought. I think the original number was like a $4.5 million. Now it's $16 million reportedly is being that they think he is stolen from Shohei Ohtani. Now this is Ohtani's interpreter Ippei Mutsuhara. Now at first, that money they thought was used to pay his gambling debts. But that seemed hard for people to believe that someone could get ripped off like that. But there have been other interpreters who've come out and said that this is something that they had to do, set up bank accounts for their clients. Now, according to federal authorities, the alleged stolen money was used for illegal sports gambling. They don't think Ohtani knew anything about it. Whatever winnings the interpreter had were not, of course, put back into Ohtani's account. They consider Ohtani the victim in this case. Now, these charges carry a maximum of 30 years in federal prison, and he's expected in court very soon for his initial appearance.
Over in golf news, the Masters starts today. Now, Tiger Woods made headlines early this week when he said he thought he could win another one if everything comes together. What would be the significance of another Masters win?
You know, from an injury standpoint, I mean, this would be his most incredible yet. And that's saying something because 5 years ago, nobody thought he could win after having all those back surgeries. And I mean, he won with having spinal fusion surgery. But also, it would get him one more major win closer to Jack Nicklaus's record of 18 major titles. Now, this is like the baseball equivalent of the home record. It's the biggest in golf. And Woods, for a long time, seemed very destined, actually, to break this record. You know, he started off 1997, at 21, he wins the Masters by 12 strokes, nearly laps the field. And it starts this torrid pace here. 14 major titles in an 11-year period. The question went from, if he's going to break the record to when and if anybody is even going to catch him. But then you see in 2008, that's his last one for an 11-year period. He had all those marriage transgressions that became public in 2010, and then he had a whole bunch of back problems here. I mean, from 2013 to 2018, he didn't win an event, period. And finally he gets there in 2019, he wins the Masters, shocks everyone. Of course, now he had that car accident 3 years ago, and he's even in worse shape with his legs. So from an injury standpoint, this would be pretty amazing. I'm pretty sure that the major record is kind of out of his reach at this point, but one more would be incredible.
And there is another less talked about record that he currently shares with the great Sam Snead for the most overall PGA wins. How realistic is it that he gets number 83?
Yeah, this one's at least a higher possibility anyway. Woods has slowed down, like I mentioned. When he won that 14th Grand Slam title in 2008, he also already had 65 major titles. You can see that was 16 years ago. He's gotten just 17 wins since then. 6 of those were in 2009. So he went from winning like 5 to 6 events for a year to at one point he goes 5 years without winning a single event. So obviously he's completely slowed down. But winning just one event obviously is going to be easier than winning a major. All the best players, of course, show up for the majors. Now today was the first round of the Masters. Tiger played through 7 holes. He is even, so we will have an update on this tomorrow as it continues.
That was Dave Martin for us. And now a Vietnamese woman who rose from humble beginnings to become one of that country's richest real estate developers was sentenced to death for fraud. 67-year-old Trong My Lang was convicted of stealing billions in loans from a Vietnamese bank she helped to create. Trong My Lang was convicted of taking out $44 billion in loans from the Saigon Commercial Bank. 83 co-conspirators, including her husband and niece, were also found guilty and received sentences ranging from 3 years to 20 years in prison. The high-profile case is a rarity for the communist country. Trong My Lang is one of very few women in Vietnam to be sentenced to death for a white-collar crime. South Korea's Liberal Opposition Party scored a landslide victory in the country's parliamentary election. This dealt a resounding blow to President Yoon Suk-yeol and his Conservative Party.
South Korea's Conservative president was dealt a resounding blow on Wednesday as the country's Liberal opposition scored a landslide victory in a parliamentary election. The Liberals were projected to fall just short of the 200 seats needed for a supermajority, but their win likely means political gridlock ahead for President Yoon Suk-yeol. Main opposition Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung thanked supporters and called it a great victory for our people. Lee had led a combative campaign against Yoon. He urged Yoon's party to work together with the opposition towards an economic recovery, calling it their top priority. The ruling People Power Party was set to win just 108 seats. President Yoon, who took office in May 2022, was not up for election this time, but the bitterly fought race was seen by some analysts as a referendum on his leadership, coming as Yoon's popularity falters under a cost of living crisis and a series of political scandals. Yoon humbly accepted the election results and pledged to renew his administration, his chief of staff said. His party's leader, Han Dong-hun, took responsibility for the loss and said he would step down. Prime Minister Han Duck-soo and other senior aides also offered to resign, according to Yonhap News. Yoon still has 3 years to go in his 5-year single term allowed by the Constitution.
The Chinese Communist Party and its sinister crime of murdering innocent people to sell their organs took center stage yesterday at a documentary screening and panel discussion. NTD's Daniel Monahan has more on the showing of medical genocide, hidden mass murder in China's organ transplant industry, and reactions to the screening.
The screening took place at Goldie Beacom College in Delaware. There were multiple speakers at the event, including William Huang, a Falun Gong practitioner who survived persecution for his spiritual beliefs in China. Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa, is a spiritual discipline introduced to the Chinese public in 1992 that encourages people to live by the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. By 1999, the practice had become enormously popular in China, with 70 to 100 million people having taken it up. The CCP, which took Falun Gong's popularity and focus on morality as a threat to its political power, launched a nationwide persecution targeting the practice in 1999. In 2019, the China Tribunal, led by an independent expert panel in London, concluded that the CCP has been forcibly harvesting organs from prisoners of conscience for years on a substantial scale, with Falun Gong practitioners being the principal source of human organs. Those in attendance at the screening praised the documentary. State Representative Michael Ramon is introducing a resolution to condemn forced organ harvesting.
We need to do something. It's been too long, and for those to be scared away, all because they're in a political position and they feel like they may have repercussions to their political career or whatever, it's not right.
Dr. Scott Glenn says it's imperative to use every organization of the government, higher education, and grade schools to get the word out.
So that everybody is educated on this situation, so that we all can be a force behind this and stop all this negativity in terms of killing people and saving lives.
Dr. Colleen Perry Keith says you hear about these sorts of things and you think they can't be happening.
The more you understand, the more you realize just how awful, people are just evil, and it all gets back to power and control.
Keith says they had a Confucius Institute at a previous college and wanted to shut it down, but the Chinese government threw up roadblocks.
There was an undercurrent there of something that was very negative, and you just couldn't quite put your finger on it, but it was the kind of thing that just needed to not be there anymore. So it was awful.
U.S. Senate candidate Eric Hansen says it's shocking how few people in the U.S. know about the multi-billion-dollar organ harvesting industry in China and its victims.
And the fact that there have been no laws passed really to a large extent to stop it, and that it just keeps going on, that's really disturbing.
School teacher Brenda Manella says she was extremely surprised at some of the information she heard.
I didn't know how, evil the CCP really is. You kind of hear a little bit, but to see the level, it's just really awful.
Local political candidate Michael Sensich sees a similarity to Germany's Dr. Mengele and his experiments.
This is blood money at the expense of these innocent people that are trying to practice their own beliefs. And it is just very saddening.
Medical genocide, hidden mass murder in China's organ transplant industry can be viewed at epochtv.com. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us now, here are some of today's top headlines. O.J. Simpson, the former NFL star who captivated the nation with his infamous murder trial, has died. He was 76 years old and had suffered from prostate cancer. President Biden met with the Prime Minister of Japan and the President of the Philippines at the White House. It was the first ever trilateral summit among the three nations as they highlighted challenges from communist China in the Indo-Pacific. Harvard University is bringing back standardized test requirements once again starting fall of 2025. The Ivy League school made test scores from the SAT or the ACT optional in 2020 during the pandemic. Iowa became the second state after Texas to approve a law that allows state authorities to arrest and deport illegal immigrants. The new law would apply to those previously denied admission to or removed from the United States. Joining me now to discuss the new immigration law in Iowa is Andrew Arthur. He is a former immigration judge and fellow in law and policy at the Center for Immigration Studies. Andrew Arthur, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Iowa's new law is set to take effect July 1st. How likely are we to see legal challenges from the Biden administration before it even takes effect, like we saw with Texas? How might this play out in court?
Yeah, I anticipate that the Department of Justice is probably going to file a lawsuit in federal court in Iowa to block the law from being implemented in Texas. DOJ actually sued 2 months in advance of the law going into effect, their law SB 4. And the judge enjoined it the day before, February 29th, the day before that law was supposed to take effect. So I anticipate that we're going to see almost exactly the same challenge in Iowa.
Now, if this law is able to take effect, it could face many difficulties, especially when it comes to deportation, which can be a very complicated topic. Now, what might this aspect of the Iowa law look like in effect?
Yeah, that's going to be the hardest part of the Iowa law to implement because the state of Iowa, like the state of Texas, doesn't have the ability to deport anyone. Under the Texas law, the magistrate that hears the criminal case for an alien who enters the United States illegally can give the alien the opportunity to simply go back across the river in lieu of being prosecuted. It's a long way from the Iowa border to the southwest border. So that's not going to be an option for them, and that probably will be the most difficult part of this law to implement if it's ever allowed to take effect.
And given all the back and forth that we've seen in the legal courts when it comes to immigration between the states versus the federal government, what does that tell us about this whole process? Who does have the right in this case?
Well, that is the interesting thing. In 2012, the Supreme Court issued a case called Arizona versus United States, in which they found that a very similar Arizona law to the one in Iowa was preempted by federal law. What they concluded was, the federal government has officers to enforce the laws, Congress makes the laws, and therefore that they have occupied the field, as they said. I think that Iowa is probably going to face similar problems to the same ones that Arizona faced, given the fact that it's in the, its law specifically pertains to aliens who are unlawfully in the United States, opposed to the Texas law, which involves sort of a trespassing offense of people across an international boundary into the United States. But it's still an important message for the state of Iowa to send, because it underscores the lack of enforcement in the United States by the Biden administration of our immigration laws.
On that note, what can states do, or do they just have to wait for the federal government?
Yeah, unfortunately, by and large, the states have to wait for the federal government, but there are things that the states can do. The states can, as Texas has done in many cases, sue to block Biden administration policies. That's been more or less unsuccessful. But they can also enter into 287G programs, which is named for a provision in the Immigration and Nationality Act, which permits their law enforcement officers to assist Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the enforcement of the laws. That's sort of the mirror opposite of a sanctuary policy. Whereas in a sanctuary policy, they attempt to block immigration enforcement. In those states that have 287G agreements, they actually assist in the process in identifying, detaining, and handing over aliens to ICE. ICE actually does have the power to deport, so that's probably the best thing that states can do.
Expanding on that, have you seen any novel approaches emerging at the state level to get around these limitations, if you will?
Sure, absolutely. The lawsuits are really the most novel one. But if you go to the state of Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis has convened a grand jury to look in particular at the issue of unaccompanied alien children entering the United States. And that grand jury has issued a number of what we call presentments that are quite shocking. They indicate that children are, sexually assaulted on the way to the United States, physically assaulted. In fact, in one case that they reference, a child was actually beheaded by the smuggler that was bringing the child to the United States. Bringing the attention of the American public to what's going on, the effects of immigration throughout the country, is probably the most effective way. In fact, when it comes to that, unwittingly, New York Mayor Eric Adams is probably the best poster child that one could hope for immigration enforcement. His city is facing billions of dollars in costs for migrants who are, clogging the streets and the hotels of New York City. And notwithstanding the fact that he, like President Biden, is a Democrat, he's no fan of what's going on at the border.
Andrew Arthur, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
A lawmaker in California says he's introducing a bill to end sanctuary state protections for illegal immigrants who've committed sexual offenses against minors. This comes after ICE recently arrested such an individual who fled from California to Massachusetts. NTD's Eileen Eng has the story.
Assemblymember Bill Asalee announced on Wednesday he is introducing legislation to end California's sanctuary state for illegal immigrant pedophiles. AB 2641 will require law enforcement to comply with federal immigration authorities in cases involving illegals convicted of child sex crimes.
This should never happen. And as lawmakers, we have an obligation and a duty to protect the citizens of this nation. And that is what I intend to do with this bill.
This comes after Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, arrested a Colombian national convicted of sex crimes against a California minor. The 23-year-old was detained on April 2nd in Boston. In a statement, Boston ICE officials said he victimized a child in California before moving to Massachusetts. We simply cannot allow him to reoffend and abuse a child here. San Bernardino County could not honor ICE's request for an advance notification of release and released him from California state custody on an unknown date.
San Bernardino was unable to honor the detainer due to California's sanctuary state laws. Yes, the laws of California prohibit law enforcement from handing over convicted child pedophiles to ICE for purposes of deportation. This is unacceptable in a civilized society.
The Colombian national entered the U.S. in May 2021 and was convicted of his crimes in December 2022.
Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Severe weather is moving through the southeast following a day when deadly storms produced destructive tornadoes and flash floods from Texas to Mississippi. NTD's Christina Corona brings us an update on the weather.
Flood watches are in effect for 7 million residents in the Florida Panhandle, southern Georgia, the Ohio Valley, and portions of New England, where 1 to 2 inches of rainfall are possible. Reports indicated water entering buildings and ongoing rescue operations in the Tallahassee, Florida area. The city received more than a month's worth of rain. The city sees 3.5 inches of rain in April, but over 7 inches fell since Wednesday night. Multiple flash flood emergencies were issued on Wednesday, including in New Orleans, as extremely moist storms brought heavy rain to parts of Texas and Louisiana. Alongside the life-threatening floods, at least 5 tornadoes touched down in Louisiana, Texas, and Alabama on Wednesday.
As far as hearing and seeing it, lights flickering back and forth, dark really quickly. It was very loud. When they say it sounds like a freight train, it most certainly does.
These storms led to extensive power outages and inflicted damage on homes and businesses throughout the areas of the Gulf Coast.
We had to evacuate more than 50 people from this structure. No fatalities, a couple of injuries, but just amazing that we got through this area, how bad the damage is, and no severely injured people.
One person has been reported dead in central Mississippi's Scott County.
Our personnel are very, very, very busy, and we're trying to make it to everybody. Please be patient with us. We're coming. This is a long process. This is something that we're not used to dealing with, but we're knocking it out.
Severe storms are possible today for 28 million people across South Carolina to Central Florida and the Ohio Valley to the Appalachians. Christina Corona, NTD News.
From the pounding of hammers to the buzz of saws, a group of Utah high school students are building more than just homes. They're also constructing their futures. NTD's Dana Monahan speaks with a school building trades teacher who runs a unique home building program.
Quinn Drury runs a one-of-a-kind home building program at Murray High School in Utah. 11 houses have been built so far in the program, which launched in 1996, plus a few sheds, garages, and mini houses. Speed is not the name of the game in the program. Drury says students learn how to do it right, or they take it apart and do it over. Locals apparently don't mind paying a little extra for quality.
Except for 2008, every home we've ever had is sold for above appraised value.
Drury says the purpose of the program is to give students real-life experiences.
I believe every kid's given special talents and abilities, and sometimes the traditional school system does not highlight the talents that these kids have. But in the real world, they will be extremely successful with what they've learned and what they can do.
The building trades instructor says that the more authentic the experience, the more the students will learn.
Best part about the home building is these kids are young. They're usually 10th, 11th, 12th grade students that we have, and they're kind of learning what they like the most. And by doing a whole house, they get a feel of everything.
Drury imparts skills he gained from a construction management program at a local college and on job sites before he began teaching 28 years ago.
Some of them are going to excel, and their talents and abilities will be in framing. Some, I've got kids that love the painting. When we start doing the painting, we got kids that, I've got several kids over the years that have become electricians or plumbers or mechanical workers.
Some love a little demolition.
I got a lot of kids that love the excavation part and running the big equipment.
Drury says he pushes those interested to get a 4-year construction management degree. Students in the program get 18 credit hours at a local college and receive a scholarship. Drury says many tradesmen are needed now in America. The former construction manager turned teacher, who once built houses working for his grandpa, says there hasn't been a meaningful push to develop apprentices or professional talent until recently.
I have a strong belief in the future of America and of these kids, that they want to work hard, they want to learn, and when given the opportunity, they can do great things.
According to a jobber survey, many students have been taught from a young age that academics are the only way toward a career. Nearly 80% of the jobber survey participants said their parents encouraged them to enroll in college. A mere 5% were guided toward vocational training. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.